The room was humming with anticipation. The Grand Assembly Hall in Washington, D.C. gleamed with diplomatic decorum, polished marble underfoot, and flags from every major nation fluttering silently behind the stage. Delegates whispered in anticipation, the hum of tension masked by polite smiles and the occasional camera shutter. The World Unity Summit was not just another political spectacle. It was the platform for unveiling sweeping reforms that promised to reshape geopolitical balances. At the center of this anticipation stood Vice President Kamala Harris. She adjusted the microphone and began her opening remarks with practiced elegance. Behind her stood a line of global dignitaries, among them the singular, striking figure of Pope Leo XIV. The crowd's energy rose with every syllable she spoke, until it all stopped. He stepped forward. No protocol, no cue, no prior signal. Pope Leo XIV, clad in traditional white with a crimson stole embroidered in ancient gold threads, gently raised a hand. Cameras clicked, murmurs turned to silence. Kamala froze, her sentence suspended mid-air. The audience, global leaders and press alike, turned their attention toward the one man who now claimed the room without uttering a word. And that's when everything changed. But before we dive into what he said, words that stunned the world and reshaped an entire event, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. These are the moments that define history, and you don't want to miss what happens next. Pope Leo's expression was serene, almost sorrowful. He made no dramatic gestures, no demands. Yet something about the way he held his gaze told the audience this was not a breach of protocol. It was a call from something far greater. Kamala, surprised but composed, lowered her notes. Her eyes met his for the briefest of seconds, and in that look a message passed silently. This wasn't about politics anymore. The summit was convened under the banner of global unification, climate accords, AI governance, and humanitarian alignment. For weeks, Harris and her team had orchestrated every line, every minute. This interruption wasn't in the plan. But the moment Pope Leo stepped forward, it was clear that the plan was no longer relevant. The Pope was not new to controversy. His papacy had been defined by bold moves, cleansing the Church of corruption, challenging nationalist movements in Europe, and publicly denouncing exploitation disguised as progress. Yet never had he directly intervened in a political summit, and certainly not on American soil, in front of the Vice President of the United States. The security teams held position, uncertain whether to act. Cardinal Matteo Rossi, the Pope's closest advisor, watched from the side, tense but unmoving. Harris's aide, Robert Klein, subtly reached for his communication earpiece, whispering to the back team without taking his eyes off the stage. The room was silent, but tension screamed through every breath. What would the Pope say? The Vice President, measuring the moment, took a half step back, not in surrender but in recognition. She had spoken to world leaders, battled tough interviews, and navigated the razor edges of political warfare. But this was different. This was spiritual, maybe even moral, and Harris, ever the strategist, knew not to confront an act of conscience with control. The silence grew heavy. The Pope looked slowly across the room, as if weighing the souls present, then nodded once as if signaling the start of something long prepared. He moved toward the podium, gracefully, reverently, with centuries of tradition behind every step. Everyone waited, and in the air hung a question that none dared speak aloud. Would his words heal or burn? Decades before the summit, Leo Bernardi had been a theology professor in Palermo, brilliant, reclusive, and fiercely principled. His writings challenged both political power and religious complacency, blending spiritual doctrine with raw human responsibility. When he was elevated to the papacy, many expected a quiet reformer. Instead, Pope Leo XIV emerged as a thunderous voice in a fractured world. He traveled to refugee camps when others sent statements. He stripped the Vatican of opulence, sold art to fund crisis relief, and refused to dine with dictators, even those cloaked in democratic legitimacy. His sermons were not soft, they were fire. His vision, a church no longer neutral in the face of suffering or corruption. His presence at the World Unity Summit was, in itself, controversial. Some welcomed his moral perspective, Others feared an ideological incursion. But few expected confrontation. The event had been designed for harmony, diplomatic speeches, climate commitments, and mutual reassurances. Kamala Harris had been chosen to deliver the keynote for her ability to weave policy with passion. It was supposed to be seamless. She had opened with universal language, shared future, joint responsibility, inclusive progress. Every phrase had been polished to perfection, aimed at global cohesion, and then the interruption. Now, with every eye fixed on the Pope, no one remembered her opening lines. Cameras no longer panned the audience. They zoomed in on the man who had broken centuries of diplomatic precedent with a single gesture. He hadn't spoken yet, but the interruption itself was already being interpreted as a message. Inside the hall, tension thickened, but outside, on social media, in newsrooms, the moment was already viral. Clips of Harris pausing mid-sentence and the Pope's gentle hand raised in silence were looping endlessly. Hashtags surged. Commentators speculated, was this a theological protest, a call to moral order, an act of political defiance? Robert Klein, Harris's lead strategist, was monitoring everything from the communication deck just off stage. His mind raced. This wasn't just a disruption, it was a recalibration. Harris stood still, composed but measured, aware that the narrative was slipping away. Cardinal Rossi, shadowing the Pope from behind, knew this move had been considered, but not confirmed. Leo XIV didn't operate by scripts. He believed in divine timing, and this moment evidently had met his standards. The Pope stepped closer to the microphone. He didn't touch it. He waited. And in that stillness, the entire room was held captive. He scanned the audience with quiet intensity, a gaze that moved not just across faces, but through them. Some leaders looked down. Others met his stare and flinched. This wasn't a man asking for attention. This was a man commanding it without force. Behind the stillness lay a rising wave of tension. What would he say? And more urgently, what would it mean? Kamala Harris remained in place, hands folded in front of her, expression unreadable. Inside, she was already recalculating how to pivot, how to reclaim the stage. But for now, she yielded. The moment became a global mirror, reflecting unease, hope, fear. The world had gathered to discuss coordination and control. Yet here stood a figure who seemed to suggest that what was missing wasn't organization, but something older, deeper, perhaps sacred. Reporters scribbled furiously. Heads of state looked around, unsure whether to applaud, to speak, or to wait. And still, silence. Not one word from the Pope yet. But already the event was no longer about global strategy. It was about something else entirely. Something that could not be planned in speeches or negotiated in panels. It was about to begin. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, but every syllable carried the weight of an ancient truth. Before we speak of unity, he began, we must speak of truth, and truth cannot be negotiated. A ripple ran through the hall. His tone was not confrontational but absolute, like stone placed upon stone to build something enduring. The audience leaned in. Kamala Harris did not move, her face held in a neutral mask. Inside, she felt the tremor of history being rewritten in real time. Pope Leo continued, we gather in grandeur while the poor die unseen. We plan governance over technologies we do not yet understand, and yet cannot govern our own hearts. We speak of peace but fund machines of war. His words, though few, pierced. He wasn't condemning any one nation. He was condemning the illusion that the summit itself could fix what humanity had broken within itself. The earth does not need your declarations. It needs your humility. A gasp. Not from the crowd, but from a diplomat in the third row. Leo had touched a nerve. Kamala's heartbeat quickened. She wasn't unfamiliar with sharp criticism, but this was different. It wasn't political, it was prophetic. And it was directed not at her, but at the very foundation of the gathering. A mirror held up to power, and in it she saw reflections she hadn't prepared for. The Pope raised a single hand again, not to silence but to soften. "There is still hope," he said, "but it does not lie in podiums, nor in press releases. It lies in repentance, in return, in remembering who we are, not as citizens of nations, but as stewards of creation." Some in the crowd averted their eyes, others stared, transfixed. He was not offering solutions, he was offering an awakening. Harris remained composed, but her mind raced. How could she follow this? How could anyone? His words cut through protocol like fire through dry wood. "Power without wisdom is violence," he said quietly, "and diplomacy without integrity is deception." He paused, letting silence punctuate his message. By now the world was watching live. Networks had broken into programming. Social feeds flooded with real-time clips. The Pope's words, spoken with neither malice nor arrogance, were being echoed in dozens of languages within minutes. Kamala's aides were texting furiously, but she didn't look down. She was listening, not just to the words, but to the impact they carried. Pope Leo then turned slightly, meeting her eyes again. He addressed her directly, but without accusation. "Madam Vice President, your voice carries far. Use it to speak what cannot be bought." There was no humiliation in his tone, no spectacle, only a challenge, delivered in the open, under the scrutiny of millions, and yet strangely intimate. She didn't respond. Not yet. Something in her shifted. She felt the weight not of shame, but of responsibility. A deep ancestral echo calling her to something more than policy. The hall was still. The press had stopped taking notes. Even the translators had paused, momentarily stunned by the clarity and force of his declarations. And then, like a whisper after thunder, Leo stepped back. His message had not been long, but it had been enough. The moment he left the podium, the entire room seemed to exhale, and yet no one felt relief. They felt exposed, as if the very core of their convictions had been peeled open. Kamala Harris, still standing where he had left her, took a breath. She would speak again, but not yet. Something had changed. Behind the stage, chaos stirred beneath a thin veneer of composure. Advisors murmured in tight circles. Messages poured in from embassies and religious institutions across the globe. Some called for clarification, others demanded apology, a few voiced admiration. But within the power corridors of Washington and the Vatican alike, the question was no longer what had just happened. It was what would happen next. Robert Klein, pale with tension, pressed his earpiece and murmured instructions to the control team. The vice president needed a response strategy, one that acknowledged the gravity of the moment without losing diplomatic ground. But even as the machinery of protocol spun into overdrive, a deeper disturbance brewed beneath the surface. Kamala remained silent. As applause faltered, and the program directors looked for ways to resume the summit, she didn't step back up. Not yet. Her hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from the aftershock of being pierced by truth, not bound by political calculations. In a quiet alcove behind the stage, she asked for 2 minutes alone. It was granted without hesitation. No one knew what to say to her anyway. She sat on a wooden bench, breathing slowly, her mind replaying Leo's words. Speak what cannot be bought. She had spent her career mastering rhetoric, understanding the art of framing, negotiating power. But never had she felt so directly addressed, not as a politician, but as a person. She stared down at her hands. For a brief moment, the weight of office fell away, leaving only the woman beneath. Elsewhere in the summit, other leaders were shaken in different ways. The president of Argentina whispered to the Prime Minister of Canada that maybe the Pope had said what many had only dared think. The Chancellor of Germany nodded silently when the French envoy murmured that perhaps this summit had forgotten its soul. Cardinal Rossi stood in the shadows near the rear doors, watching the reactions with intense scrutiny. He knew Leo's words were not impulsive. They had been formed through prayer, through solitude, through years of aching over a world losing its compass. And now they had landed. The world would not be the same. In the Vatican communications chamber, calls surged. Bishops in Africa, Asia, Europe. It was as if the Pope had lit a signal fire in the sky, and hearts across continents had seen it. Some joyful, some furious, all alert. And yet, in the midst of this, something subtle began to unfold. A delegate from Kenya stood and asked to revise his statement, citing a renewed sense of urgency. A young climate advocate from Norway, previously sidelined to a back panel, was invited to move to the main stage. The Secretary General of the UN postponed his original remarks, requesting time to respond meaningfully to recent interventions. The shift was not declared. It rippled quietly. But unmistakably, the tone of the summit had changed, and Kamala Harris felt it. She rose slowly, rejoining her team. The tension in the room now felt like the air before a storm, not of destruction, but of transformation. She didn't yet have the words, but she knew that when she spoke again, they would not be the ones she had rehearsed. For the first time in years, she wasn't planning what to say next. She was listening, and all around her others were beginning to do the same. Pope Leo XIV sat quietly once more, his expression unreadable as the summit struggled to regain form. But the equilibrium had shifted. A new gravity settled in the room, one that words alone could no longer shape. Kamala Harris returned to the stage without notes. The murmurs ceased. She didn't clear her throat or posture for the cameras. She simply looked at the audience, then at the Pope, and began. "Your Holiness," she said softly, "thank you." A hush fell. It was not submission, it was clarity. "You reminded us of what cannot be forgotten, and I won't pretend your words haven't shaken me." "They have," she paused. "We came here with plans, with structure, with conviction, but maybe we forgot the foundation beneath all that. Why we serve. Who we serve." Her voice steadied. "So let me speak, not just as Vice President, but as a woman, as a daughter, as a citizen of this fragile earth. We've failed in some ways. We've protected systems at the expense of people. We've chosen convenience over courage." Gasps echoed faintly, not from outrage but from recognition. "And yet," she continued, "we're here, still gathered, still willing to listen, even when the truth is hard." The transformation was not theatrical, it was internal. Her posture shifted, not to project power but presence. She began to speak of responsibility, not just of initiatives. Of moral accountability, of the silent suffering ignored by statistics. And she didn't speak as if she had answers, but as if she had finally begun to ask the right questions. The Pope listened, unmoved yet fully engaged. He had said what he came to say. Now it was the world's turn to respond. In the hours that followed, the summit moved forward, but with new momentum. Nations reworded declarations, no longer hiding behind bureaucratic caution. Several pledged new funds for grassroots humanitarian efforts, bypassing traditional power structures. A coalition formed to protect displaced indigenous communities, with leadership offered to those most affected. And across the world, reaction was electric. Social media overflowed not with outrage, but with reflection. Debates turned introspective. Churches held vigils. University classrooms abandoned lectures to discuss moral leadership. In cities, public squares filled not with protest, but with silence, listening. For Pope Leo XIV, this wasn't a victory. It wasn't about triumph, it was about ignition, a spark. He left the summit as quietly as he had entered, offering no interviews, giving no further statements. His words were already doing what he had hoped, living on their own. As for Kamala Harris, something within her remained changed. In the days that followed, she initiated a national listening tour, not as a campaign, but as an act of service. Her speeches grew more grounded, her decisions more transparent. Critics remained, of course, but even they had to admit, something had shifted. And perhaps most profoundly, the summit had become a symbol, not of what the world had achieved, but of what it could become when truth refused to be sidelined. Because sometimes history turns not on legislation or elections, but on a single voice, clear, unshaken, impossible to ignore. And if you found this story as powerful as we did, don't leave just yet. Subscribe to the channel for more real-world stories that challenge, inspire, and reveal. This is just one of many moments where unexpected truth reshapes expected power. And don't forget to click the next video on screen. You won't want to miss what unfolds next. The world is watching and history is far from done.